old channel, I had did an article on the Civil War generals. Some of those generals were so damn dumb. I think children would have done a better job in leading their armies. They were as dumb as dirt. And it was not shocking after reading about many of the generals, why they lost. Okay, you don't let the dummy lead. But let's get into this, ladies and gentlemen. From the Journal of the Civil War Era.org, and I'll leave the link to this article in the description box. But let's get into the South. Civil War veterans and opiate addiction in the Gilded Age. You know, the history that they never want to tell you about. Because if they don't look like heroes in the whole thing, then that history can't be told. But I'm right here to shine the big old sunlight on it with some hogweed and wild parsnip, y'all. Let's get into it. In November 2015, two Princeton economists, Dr. Angus Deaton and Dr. Ann Case, published a startling report which indicated that the mortality rates of poorly educated middle-aged white Americans had skyrocketed. These mortality rates, Deaton and Case argued, were not being driven by the usual suspects of diabetes or heart disease, but by suicide, alcoholism, and opioid addiction. Among 45 to 54-year-old with no more than a high school education, death rates increased by 134 per 100,000 from 1999 to 2014. This sad revelation has been billed as unparalleled in American history, with Dr. Deaton himself unable to find a historical comparison. However, rampant opioid addiction rates do have a historical parallel here in the United States, and especially the American South. After the Civil War, Southern whites during the Gilded Age arguably had the highest addiction rates in the country and possibly the world. How do we know? Some of the evidence is anecdotal. For instance, in The Opium Habit, published in 1868, Horace B. Day estimated 80,000 to 100,000 Americans were addicted to opium. In 1915, Congress passed the Harrison Narcotic Act. See, they were passing bills for drugs back then, and guess what they're doing today? Passing bills for drugs today, which required anyone who imported, produced, sold, or dispensed narcotics to register, pay a tax, and keep detailed records. David Courtwright, a historian of addiction, analyzed these records from the Harrison Act and demonstrated that addiction rates in the South were much worse than anywhere else. Now, you think about that, ladies and gentlemen. Slavery ended. The slaves left the plantation. The South collapsed. They went through a famine. And on top of all of that, there was drug addiction running rampant in the South. Now, do you understand why they could not rise without all kinds of help with building it back up? The North had to pour money into the South, and then they had to come up with the 13th Amendment to get the slaves back down there and get you back out there doing free servitude again, because they couldn't do it on their own, ladies and gentlemen. They didn't do all that work on their own. As usual, they needed a lot of help. So let's get back into this. In Atlanta, for instance, 2 out of every 1,000 people were addicted to an opioid. The worst southern city, though, was Shreveport, Louisiana, where almost 10 out of every 1,000 were addicted to opium or morphine. These numbers were much higher than anywhere else in the United States, arguably in the world. Addiction rates were not born equally among Southerners either. White Southerners were far likelier to consume opium or heroin than Black Southerners. And this is one of the books, The Age of Drugs by Louis Derrymill, I don't know, 1900, courtesy of the Library of Congress. So they even wrote books, ladies and gentlemen, about their drug addiction. They even wrote books about it. Ain't those kids walking out with some drugs? Some kids, or illustration of kids getting some drugs. All right, let's move on. Why was opium and morphine addiction so rampant in the United States in the Gilded Age? The answer rests with the outcome of the Civil War. Thousands of Civil War soldiers who were wounded during combat, or more commonly became sick in camp, were first dosed with opium or morphine in the field hospitals during the war. Many came home struggling with addiction to narcotics. First tasted in a hospital, one Union soldier who had endured 10 months of prison life at Andersonville returned home with an opium addiction, first doled out at a hospital in Wilmington. He regularly consumed opium, but when he tried to quit cold turkey, found that opium had an incredibly strong hold on him. No tongue or pen will ever describe the depths of horror in which my life was plunged at this time. The days of humiliation and anguish, nights of terror and agony, though which I dragged my wretched being, he wrote. And here you see somebody laying in an opium den right here, all strung out on opium. You know, that this was 1904 when our people were getting locked up for free servitude again through the 13th Amendment, and sharecropping, y'all. Sharecropping. We were out doing backbreaking work and they were getting high. All right, moving on. Confederate soldiers returned to a defeated and humiliated South, with cities like Atlanta in near ruin. And do you know many of them soldiers ran away as fugitives out of the South? Some went as far as Canada after the Civil War because they were afraid they would be arrested. Furthermore, 1 out of every 5 Southern males of military age were killed in the war. Many heartbroken families turned to drugs to cope with the devastating loss of a husband, son, brother, or father. Maimed and shattered survivors from 100 field battles. Horace B. Day wrote in 1868, diseased and disabled soldiers released from hostile prisons, anguished and hopeless wives and mothers, made so by the slaughter of those who were dearest to them, have found many of them temporary relief from their sufferings in opium. So in order for them to get through their grieving, they had to use drugs for that, ladies and gentlemen. They needed drugs to get through hard times. Yes, they needed drugs to get through hard times. So today, much of the opioid plague stems from prescription drug use. The CDC claimed in 2014 that every day 46 people die from a prescription drug overdose. Prescription drug abuse fueled the opioid plague during the Gilded Age as well. Opium, heroin, and morphine were legal tools for the apothecary physician during and after the Civil War. The science of addiction had not yet emerged, and doctors prescribed opium and morphine regularly for pain management and sleep problems. A.M. Chappell was a veteran of the 14th Virginia Infantry and had been wounded at the Battle of Gettysburg when a ball crashed through his left knee. It was a wound that Chappell noted would never get entirely over. By 1886, Chappell was very poor indeed, and with a wife and children to support. He wrote to Lee Camp Soldiers Home for admissions into the institution. In his letter, he noted the lingering disability, poverty, and his addiction to morphine. Ladies and gentlemen, the South was in bad shape. Again, they could not do it without the help of slaves and money being poured into the South to bring them back to the state they are in today. They did not do this on their own. This was also another reason why the 13th Amendment was a necessity, because the South had to be built back again. And as you could see, many of these people were junkies. They sure couldn't do it. Strung out on drugs. The majority of the people in the South strung out on drugs. What are they going to build? If they couldn't build up this country without drugs, you know damn well they can't do it with drugs. Okay, moving on. The destruction of slavery and the Southern slave economy. That is the only economy that fueled America, ladies and gentlemen. That's why it was called the slave economy, because all of the wealth that America had obtained came through slavery. So when these people try to deny these things, all you got to do is go back in history and just look up slave economy. They sure didn't call it anything else, because that's where everything came from in America. Everything. Also led many Southerners to turn to drug use. See, because they no longer had their slave, they no longer had their livelihood, so they turned to drugs. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution legally overthrew the system of slavery, and 4 million African American men, women, and children were free. In an instant, when they abolished slavery and it was wiped out, billions of dollars in slave capital. Okay, so when they wiped out slavery, they also wiped out billions that these people could no longer earn because the slaves were not there carrying their behinds all through Southern history and American history, because slavery was everywhere. And I already did a video on that one. Okay. In addition, the introduction of wage labor along with international competition hobbled the cotton industry. Slavery was an immoral and incredibly cruel institution with no redeeming qualities. Its destruction was long overdue. Yeah, well, some of these people walk around even today acting like they're a slave master, so they are definitely that in their minds. Okay, but the institution's demise wiped out vast sums of wealth in the American South, leaving many white Southerners destitute and impoverished. Wait a minute. I thought you could do everything and you didn't need nobody. Okay. To me, if when the slaves walked away, that was your big chance to show that you could farm your own land, grow your own food, and run your own economy without no one's help. But it didn't pan out that way, did it? Didn't turn out that way. There's a reason for that, ladies and gentlemen. There's a reason for that. Okay? Now, to this day, these are the same people that try to tell us we need them. But history shows it's the other way around. Now, if they were indeed the capable people that they claim they are, then the South should have never gone through a famine. The South should have never collapsed. The South should have been able to get on their feet without no one else's help. But it didn't turn out that way. The 13th Amendment put our people back in servitude. Who do you think built the South back up after the Civil War? These junkies? Nah, ladies and gentlemen. No. If you're impoverished and you're destitute and you got a major drug problem in the South, your ass ain't building anything. Just wanted to shed some light on that. So when the slaves left, billions of dollars also left the South, ladies and gentlemen, because they didn't have anybody to mooch off of anymore. So let's move on. In addition, the introduction of wage labor along with international competition hobbled the cotton industry. Slavery was, we know that. But the institution demise wiped out vast sums of wealth. So wait a minute, if you didn't need us, then how did that wipe out wealth? Get out there and do the work yourself. What's the problem? You can't. Okay, sunscreen didn't exist back then. You would have burnt up and died. So many of the white Southerners were destitute and impoverished. To cope with this sudden loss, many Southerners turned to drug use. So, ladies and gentlemen, let me repeat this again. The South fell. The Civil War veterans were junkies. Many of the people, civilians, were junkies. They went through a famine. They were poor. They were destitute. They were foreclosed on. And they could not build up the South with all of these useless people down there. How you going to build the South back up with a bunch of junkies? You couldn't. You couldn't. That manpower came from Black men, women, and children. That's what built that South back up. That's what I'm trying to show you. They were in no shape to rebuild the South. Reality is something else, ain't it? Let's move on. This was clear to many Americans living in the Gilded Age. Since the close of the war, remarked by a New York opium dealer, men once wealthy but impoverished by the rebellion. So wealthy people became poor in the South, y'all. The wealthy became poor. Have taken to eating and drinking opium to drown their sorrows. It also explains why the weight of addiction was not carried equally between the races. Black Southerners were far less likely to be addicts, partly because the defeat of the Confederacy was celebrated, not mourned. No, I don't think why would they celebrate the Confederacy? In the wake of the death and destruction of the war, those most affected by it, soldiers and Southern whites, turned to opium in alarming numbers. Many addicts first introduce an opioid in a hospital or by a family physician. They use opium or morphine to cope with the lingering illness or injury, grief, or economic loss from the war. While much different, the modern opioid plague is not the first. Deindustrialization and the shredding of the social safety net has been high school educated, middle-aged whites with few options. Many have turned to opioids to cope, just like they're turning to it now. So, ladies and gentlemen, I wanted to shed light on two things. The shape these folks were in after the Civil War. There is no way they can make the claim that they were the ones to rebuild the South. Black people rebuilt that South. They weren't strung out on drugs. These folks were strung out on drugs. They were impoverished. They went through a famine. They couldn't even cope in life without drugs. They lost all of their wealth. So all of their wealth was tied to slavery. They didn't have their wealth any other way. If that were not the case, you should not have lost a dime when the slaves walked away. When the slaves walked away, all of their money was gone. So everything they had was tied to slavery. And there's no way they rebuilt the South in the shape that they were in down there. No way. Please leave your comment and subscribe. Don't forget to hit on the notification bell. And ladies and gentlemen, I will see you on the next video. We rebuilt the South. Period. Peace, family.